and welcome to the 2022 Totally Tunisian Calendar Blanket Project. If you've never had a chance to do Tunisian crochet, this is the year for you. We are going to learn 12 Tunisian stitches, one each month. We're going to turn them into 12-inch squares, and at the end of the year, we're going to put all those squares together and add a border. A really pretty blanket and a really neat way to learn Tunisian crochet. Since this is the first video in this year's series, we are going to talk a bit about yarn and hooks before we get to the Tunisian simple stitch tutorial. First, let's talk about yarn. I'm going to be using a size 4 medium weight acrylic yarn for this project. It's the same kind of yarn that we use here for most of our calendar blankets. I've chosen 3 colors from my stash this year. I'm going to be using a nice soft mustard color, a nice soft coral color, and I'm finally getting into this gigantic ball of sage green. This is going to be the border color for all 12 of my squares plus my blanket border. So I'm going to alternate my squares in between the coral and the mustard. Having said that, you can use any color you want for this project. You can stash dive, you can use solid colors, self-striping colors. I'd stay away from the variegated yarns for the actual Tunisian stitches in particular, because variegated yarn doesn't show off how fancy Tunisian stitch work can actually be. So solid colors or even self-striping is just fine for this. But you can use a different color per month. You can make your entire blanket the same color. You can make it just solid colored blocks and a single color for your border. Make it to suit your room, make it to suit your palette, or just use up what you've got in your stash. And if you're just going to be practicing Tunisian stitch work along with us this year, then you can use whatever you want. Next, let's talk tools. We are going to be using what's known as a Tunisian or Afghan crochet hook for this project. So if you've never used a Tunisian or Afghan crochet hook before, or you need to buy one, we're going to talk about 3 different kinds that you can be on the lookout for, which one we recommend, and of course, sizing. The first one we're going to talk about is the classic Afghan or Tunisian crochet hook. It's long like a knitting needle, has a hook on one end and a stopper on the other. And the stopper is there to keep your loops from falling off the edge, because every other row of Tunisian crochet has all of your loops on the hook. But of course we'll talk about that in the actual tutorial. The second hook you might see is something known as a crow hook. It's long like a knitting needle and it has a hook on both ends. Now I'm going to be using the crow hook for this project. Not just because it's long, but also because this pretty blue that it came in really stands out against the yarn I've chosen, so we'll all be able to see the stitches a lot better. You can use a crow hook, especially if you're comfortable with Tunisian, because the loops could slide off the edge if you're using a whole lot of loops. But for this project, we're only going to be managing 38. So a long crow hook would be just fine too. And finally, you may have seen something like this. This is a regular crochet hook with a wire attached to it, and these are made especially for making big blanket projects with Tunisian stitch, so that wire is where all of your hooks line up. And of course, they make knitting needles like this too. If you've never used an Afghan hook before, I would not recommend getting this one to start with. It's because sometimes all those loops can get a little bit crammed up at the end where they kind of come back onto the hook, and this can get a little bit annoying. So if you're new to Tunisian crochet, I highly recommend the traditional Tunisian crochet hook or the long crow hook like I'm going to be using. I'm going to be using a 5.5mm hook for this project. It's also known as an I or a 9. But you can also use a 5mm, which is a H or an 8, or you can use a 6mm, which is a J or a 10. So any of those sizes would be fine, but make sure you're using the same size hook throughout your project for consistency's sake. If you've never picked up an Afghan hook, we have links in the description box down below of 3 different pretty little sets that you might consider. 2 of them are sets, one of them is just a single hook. And to find the description box, it will be located underneath your video player. And depending on the software you're on, you might have to click a little read more sign there. You might have to click a little tiny arrow that sends underneath it, or if you just tap on the title of the video, the description box should open up. And that's where you'll find it. Each square in this project is going to use around 100 yards of yarn. So if you're stash diving, then keep an eye on the label amounts on your yarn, or if you're out purposely purchasing yarn for this project, keep in mind 1,200 yards for all 12 squares in total, and that includes the border, plus an extra 1,200 yards just sort of to factor in for a border on your blanket. Most throw blanket sizes, and I would classify this in the larger throw blanket size, wind up being around 1,400 yards of a size 4 medium weight yarn. So 90 to 95 yards of your actual square color, and then maybe 5 to 10 yards for the little border on each square, and that generally works out to 1,400 yards in total. So if you are buying all of your yarn together, that's what you want to do. But if you're just thinking about each square individually, each square is about 100 yards altogether. So let's meet the first stitch of the year. In January, we are going to be learning the Tunisian simple stitch. Now, we do have a tutorial for this also on our channel from a few years back, but since this is the start of a really nifty project, we thought we would go back to the basics, and this is going to be our first 12-inch square. Tunisian crochet is a little different than regular crochet, and one row actually consists of a forward pass and a backwards pass. And when I say it's like a hybrid with knitting, it's because every other row we have all of our loops on the hook, and then the rows in between we are taking all those loops off. We're going to show you all of that in the tutorial. So without further ado, let's grab those long hooks, let's grab our yarn, we'll head on over to the craft table, and we will start stitching up the 2022 Totally Tunisian Calendar Blanket project together. Please visit our shop and purchase a pattern. It helps support our show, and we'll put a link to our shop in the description box down below. For our Tunisian simple stitch square, I'll be using a 5.5mm Afghan hook, also known as an I or a 9, and I also have a 5.5mm regular crochet hook. This is optional. We'll be adding a border to each of our squares, and we'll be switching back to regular crochet stitches for it. So of course you can continue to use the Afghan hook for your border, but if you find it more comfortable to switch back to a regular hook at that point, you can do that too. You just want to make sure that both of your hooks are the same size. And again, I'm using a 5.5mm, also known as an I or a 9. You want a pair of scissors, a yarn needle, and the yarn I'm using for this year's blanket is a size 4 medium weight 100% acrylic yarn. Each square uses 100 yards in total. That's around 90 yards of your main stitch color and around 10 yards for the border color. My border will be a sage green throughout, and this month's square is a pretty gold. And once you've got all that together, we can get started. We're going to take our main square color and we're going to start with a slip knot. Like a lot of things, we're going to begin with a basic foundation chain row. We're going to chain 38 to begin. 38 chains. We should all now have 38 foundation chains, and 38 is the number of stitches that you will have in each row all the way forward. But here's where we diverge from regular crochet. Tunisian crochet is made using a 2-row repeating pattern. Every odd row, known as the forward pass, picks up a loop for every single stitch represented in your foundation row. So every odd row, you're going to wind up with all these loops based along the length of your hook, which is why we need the long hook. Every even row, also known as the backwards or reverse pass, is where we do the actual crocheting. Yarn over, pull back through 2, yarn over, pull back through 2, the thing that's sort of familiar with crochet. And by the end of the even rows, you're back down to a single loop. So here we go. We are going to skip the first chain from the hook. The loop that is currently on our hook counts as the loop of a working stitch. Skip this first chain, find the next one, and you're going to pick up a loop on your hook, as if you were going to single crochet, but that's it. You're just picking up a loop. We're going to go to the next chain, slip in our hook, yarn over, pick up a loop, and leave it. Go to the next chain, slip your hook in, yarn over, pick up a loop, and leave it. We will have a loop on our hook for each of those 4 chains so far. Go to the next chain, yarn over, pick up a loop, go to the next chain, yarn over, pick up a loop, and that's all you're going to do all the way across for your first odd row. This is a forward pass. We are picking up a loop for each of those stitches represented by our foundation chains. At the end of the forward pass of row 1, you will have 38 loops on your hook, and it's a good idea to actually count them, especially if you're very new to Tunisian crochet, because you want to make sure you've got a loop for every single one of those chains in your foundation chain row. You'll have 38 loops all the way along. That is the forward pass. At the end of the forward pass, you'll always have every single loop on your hook, and that's why we need the long hook. You can, as you work, sort of move those loops around, and if you're a knitter, then you know how this sort of feels in your hand. So if you have to grab it, maybe you're holding it back here and you're comfortable, but at first, if you're still getting used to it, feel free to grab the whole thing, have your hand right around those loops. It's perfectly all right, and really you want to be able to keep control of your yarn. Now we do the reverse pass, and this is where the actual crocheting comes in. And for the Tunisian simple stitch, it's really quite simple, and it'll look very familiar. We're going to yarn over, and for the first stitch of every single reverse row, you'll just pull it back once through one loop. And that creates a sort of running chain that's going to go all the way up the edge of our square. So yarn over, pull back through one loop only. And that's the first stitch of every reverse row. For the rest of the reverse row, yarn over and pull back through 2 loops, just like a single crochet. Yarn over, pull back through 2 loops. I like to continually move my loops around on my hook. This helps keep a nice even tension on them. So when I pull my yarn back over my hook, the size of my hook will open the loop and make it the actual width of the hook, which in this case is 5.5 millimeters. If I let it get tight near the neck of the hook, I'll end up with a tighter stitch. So I always like to just pull it back as I work, just to make sure I'm getting the right sized loop. Yarn over, pull back through 2, yarn over, pull back through 2, and you're going to love how fast you get at this. And now you can see the first full row of stitches forming. We have a vertical bar and we have little horizontal loops running in between. And that is what the Tunisian simple stitch looks like. So you're going to yarn over and pull back through 2 loops all the way across until you're left with only 1 loop on your hook. And I'll catch up with you there. The act of yarning over and pulling back through the last 2 loops left is what leaves you with a single loop on your hook, and you know that you're finished your reverse pass. So that completes one entire row of Tunisian simple stitch. And it's pretty easy to count. You just want to focus on these vertical bars. So these guys all the way across. That's the most important part of the stitch, because that's the sort of thing we're going to be looking for as we move forward for the rest of this little pattern. One thing I want to mention, Tunisian crochet rolls like crazy. You're going to feel like you've got a little burrito hanging underneath your crochet hook, because like knitting, it really wants to roll up. So don't worry, because when we block our squares, it'll all be nice and tidy. Plus adding the border on the square will help even out that tension a little bit too. So if it really wants to roll up on you, that's perfectly normal. Don't worry about it. Okay, we are going to do a full row 2 now of our Tunisian simple stitch pattern. This is another forward pass. It's an odd row, and we are picking up loops for this entire row. We are looking for the vertical bars of each stitch, and they're pretty easy to see. If you have to sort of pause every once in a while and just flatten out your work, that's what you're looking for. They practically stand straight up and down. Here is the first loop of the first stitch, and we have a loop already on our hook, so this loop is already accounted for. We find the next bar, slip our hook underneath it, yarn over, and pick up a loop. And again, I like to move my hook right through those loops to make sure that they're getting the right amount of sizing. Find the next vertical bar, slip your hook under it, yarn over, and pick up a loop. It is exactly the same thing that we were doing with the foundation chain, except now we're just grabbing underneath the vertical bars of each of those Tunisian simple stitches. So work your way across, slip your hook under the vertical bar on the front of the fabric, yarn over and pick up a loop, and you're gathering a loop for each of those vertical bars all the way across. At the end of this forward pass, you will still have 38 loops on your hook. If you don't have 38 loops, take a moment, go back and see where you may have missed picking up a loop in one of those vertical bars. As you get to the end of a row, your work may have twisted around your hook. This is what knitting also looks like in the very early stages, so don't worry, you can just untwist it, maybe pull some of those loops down out of the way. And I wanted to show you what the last pickup looks like on a forward pass. So that last vertical bar, you don't want to miss it. It's always right at the very edge, and you want to make sure you pick up a loop in that last vertical bar because that is the last stitch in the row. And then you can just run your fingers across it and make sure you've got 38 loops all along your hook. And you see what I mean by wanting to roll. This just wants to keep rolling and rolling and rolling. It's totally normal. No matter what your tension is, whether it's tight or loose or even, it's still going to want to roll, and that's just the nature of this particular stitch. This is the right side of the Tunisian simple stitch, where you see those vertical bars. This, by contrast, is the quote wrong side of the Tunisian stitch, and doesn't that look like knitting? That's why this is such a fun hybrid. So personally, I like both sides. You've got this cute little pearly bump on the wrong side, and you've got the nice flat vertical bar shape on the right side. That is forward pass number 2 of row or complete row number 2 done. So that's 38 stitches, and now you're just going to Tunisian simple stitch all the way back. Remember, the first worked loop of every reverse pass is yarn over and pull back through only one. You are left with a single loop on your hook, and you always start by creating a single loop on the other side, and that just keeps your edges flat and even. So don't forget that first stitch is always yarn over, pull back through one loop. The rest of it is like single crochet. Yarn over, pull back through 2, yarn over, pull back through 2, yarn over, pull back through 2. And you're going to continue that all the way across. Take your time, nice and easy. And there's that lovely simple stitch showing up underneath our hook. That is the end of row 2 completed. Now, unlike crochet where you create a full stitch with every single row, with Tunisian you create a full stitch with every 2 rows, or every forward pass and reverse pass. So every row of stitches consists of a forward pass and a reverse pass. We will have 32 complete rows of Tunisian simple stitch by the end of this square, which means you will do 32 forward passes and 32 reverse passes. And it's really easy to count your rows. You're just looking for those vertical bars. One vertical bar equals 1 row. There's another vertical bar that shows me that I've made 2 complete rows. And when you're back to a single loop on your hook, you know you've completed a reverse pass. And if you've got all your loops on your hook, you've completed a forward pass. When you start a forward pass, remember that this first vertical bar is already accounted for by the loop that's sitting on your hook. You want to find the next vertical bar, slip your hook in front of it, or I should say through it, but you're staying on the front of your Tunisian simple stitch fabric, yarn over, pick up a loop in it. And I'm specifying that you're staying on the front because as we move forward through the year, we're going to be jumping that hook all over the place. But don't worry, we're going to just slowly build up our Tunisian stitch vocabulary, and you're going to have so much fun doing all these individual stitches. So there's 1 loop for each of those vertical bars so far. You want to work all the way across, picking up a loop for each vertical bar. That's a loop for each stitch in that row. You'll have 38 loops on your hook at the end of every forward pass. You'll have 1 loop left on your hook at the end of every reverse pass. And it's always a good idea to count as you go, or as you get more comfortable, just zip through it, count your loops at the end of every row just to make sure that you haven't missed anything. And if it's rolling up on you, don't worry, that's totally normal. That's the end of a forward pass. That's the forward pass of row 3, and I have 38 stitches, or 38 loops, I should say, representing 38 stitches on my hook. And yep, it wants to roll, but that's perfectly okay. The forward pass is complete. Now I'm going to complete the reverse pass for the row 3 of stitches. Yarn over, pull back through that first loop only, and that creates the new bar along the edge of my square. And then yarn over and pull back through 2. Yarn over, pull back through 2. Yarn over, pull back through 2. It really helps to keep a thumb and forefinger, or to keep some kind of control, by gripping the fabric right underneath those stitches. That allows you to move your work along the hook. It allows you to keep some semblance of control over the yarn as you wrap it over the hook, however you hold your yarn. I do find it helpful to kind of hold the work underneath the hook as I crochet along. And that is all you have to do for the Tunisian simple stitch. So every row consists of a forward pass and a reverse pass. You'll do 32 forward passes and 32 reverse passes in total. We are just completing the reverse pass of row 3, which means we've got another 29 rows to go. I'm just completing the reverse pass of row 3. It's easy to count your rows. You're looking for those vertical bars. 1, 2, 3. I know that I've completed 3 full rows of Tunisian simple stitch now. That is 3 full rows. We want 32 in total. So you've got 29 more passes forward and back to go. So remember that each of those rows represents a forward pass and a reverse pass. You're not finished with a row of Tunisian simple stitch until you've done both the forward and the reverse pass. And that's how this differs so strongly from regular crochet. Remember, you're always left with a loop on your hook. That loop always represents this little chain running up the side of your square. And when you finish a forward pass, you'll have a loop for each of those vertical bars represented on your hook. When you start your reverse pass, you want to yarn over and pull back through the first loop only, and that creates this little loop that runs up the edge of your other side of your square. So you always want to make sure you're only taking 1 loop off. You start with 1 loop always on, and you take 1 loop off to begin every reverse pass. And everything in the middle is just yarn over, pull back through 2, kind of like a simple crochet, or I should say a single crochet. Count your rows by checking those vertical bars, and it's the vertical bars you want when you start your forward pass. I'm going to let you guys work on the Tunisian simple stitch all on your own, and I'll see you at the end of the reverse pass of row 32. That is 32 complete rows, 32 forward passes and 32 reverse passes of the Tunisian simple stitch. And there's my rolled up burrito, as I told you it would look like. This really wants to roll, but that's okay because that's just the nature of Tunisian crochet. But look at that lovely simple stitch. All those vertical bars of each stitch sitting directly on top of each other from the stitch before. All right, at the end of your last reverse pass, you're left with a single loop on your hook. We are going to fasten off. So snip your yarn, just pull that tail through your last loop, and we are going to switch up now and put on a little border. So very, very simple. We're not going to close off the top row. with a Tunisian slip stitch. We might learn that in a future video. You're just going to finish your last reverse pass, fasten off, and then you can grab your regular hook, or you can continue with your Tunisian hook. It's up to you. But now you want to grab your border color. You want to make sure that you start working across the top of your last row. So here's where we fastened off. We're going to grab our border color. I'm using my regular hook. It's still the same size as my Tunisian hook, but it's just easier for me to grab. And since we're doing regular crochet around the edging, I figured I would switch back to the regular hook. Take your border color, put a slip knot on your hook. And we're going to join our yarn in the vertical bar of the first stitch on the last row of our square. And we're going to join with a single crochet. So we're going to just pull up a loop and single crochet. Now I'm going to work over top of my little tails, but you could leave them out the back and weave them in later if you wanted to. We're going to focus on the vertical bars of each of those stitches from the last row. So I'm going to just make sure I'm working over top of my short tails here. And we're just going to single crochet. So I'm single crocheting around the vertical bars from the previous row. And because Tunisian really wants to sort of roll on you, you just want to start nice and slowly. Try to keep your tension a little on the relaxed side, because Tunisian crochet does tend to be kind of tight. It's just sort of the nature of it. So we're picking up loops in that vertical bar of each stitch all the way across. And we're using the regular single crochet. But because we're working through that vertical bar in the front, we're going to get a really neat kind of almost twisted effect, because our single crochets are going to be worked around that bar. And single crochet is thicker than simple Tunisian stitch, because the Tunisian stitch patterns tend to be a little more like knitting. They're flatter, they use up less yarn. So acting as a very simple border, our single crochet stitch is going to create a little bit of interest, a little bit of thickness, an opportunity to switch up the colors, and it will help to even out some of that roll that Tunisian simple stitch wants to do. So just work across that last row of Tunisian simple stitch with a regular single crochet stitch, working single crochets into each of those vertical bars. You'll have 38 stitches across the top. Remember that the last bar of the last stitch is right at the very edge there. So that's where stitch number 38, single crochet number 38, is worked. So you'll have 38 stitches all the way across the top of that last row of Tunisian simple stitch. And then we're going to chain one and work a single crochet into the same bar. So now we're working down the side of our Tunisian simple stitch. And one of the reasons I love bordering Tunisian stitches in general is that there's really always an obvious place to put your hook. So there's no guesswork here. You're just going to work a single crochet into each of those vertical bars, which are now kind of horizontal. They're the edge of those stitches running all the way down that first side. So really easy to see. And because there were 32 rows, we're going to have 32 stitches running down the side until we get to the bottom foundation chain row. But I'll hook up with you there. So the first single crochet we count running down the edge is worked into the same bar as the last single crochet from the top. So single crochet, chain one, single crochet in that last bar. It makes for a very small, tidy little corner. Stitch number 32 will be worked at the edge of the first row one, and now we've got our foundation chains down here. So we're going to work a single crochet into that first foundation chain. It'll be right where your little joined yarn is. So that actually equals 33 single crochets running down the edge. Chain 1 and single crochet in the same foundation chain. Running across the bottom, you're just going to be single crocheting in each foundation chain all the way across. And they're pretty easy to see. I like to slip my hook under sort of both the loops that cross. And it looks like it's sort of sitting right in the middle of a Tunisian stitch. So if I put my hook right between those two vertical bars, that slips it right underneath both of those loops of the bottom foundation chain. I'm working over that little short tail, and I'll have 38 single crochet running across the bottom of my square. Stitch number 38 across the bottom is worked into that last foundation chain that kind of separates the edge of the first stitch. So this is row 1, the forward and reverse pass of row 1, and you should sort of see the side loop slightly split after you've worked 38 stitches across the bottom. Chain 1 and single crochet in the same place, and that will leave you with 32 bars running up the edge of the other side of your square. And we're going to use the front bar. So we're using the front bar. You see that you've got what looks like a regular stitch running along the side of your square. We're just using the front bar, not the whole stitch, because the front bar is that vertical bar that identifies the edge of the first stitch. So that's the vertical bar, and we're just using that front bar. And that's so that we keep some kind of consistency all the way around the edge of our square. So you'll have a total of 33 stitches on both sides and 38 stitches across the top and the bottom of your square. And because the Tunisian simple stitch is just a little wider than it is taller, 38 stitches by 32 rows will give us roughly a 12-inch or 30-centimeter square after blocking. And unlike a lot of blanket projects, I recommend that you block your individual Tunisian stitch squares. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can certainly get them all put together towards the end and block the entire project at once, but you can certainly block the individual squares. It will make them lie nice and flat, and while you're storing them, before we put them all together at the end of the year, make sure to store them flat. You can even put some big heavy books on top of them if you want to help keep them nice and flat. Just remember that if you are steam blocking or wet blocking your squares, you want to let them dry completely before you store them. You'll have 33 stitches running up both sides, and the last stitch, so stitch number 33, worked up your last side, will be worked into the same vertical bar, so this guy right here that we joined our border color with a single crochet in to begin with. So here's stitch number 33, worked into that vertical bar. Chain 1, the little chain 1s in our corner, we don't really count them, they're just sort of there to give us a little bit of flexibility as we turn corners. We're going to join our yarn with a slip stitch to that first single crochet that we began the whole border with, and you will probably see that your square wants to unwind a little bit, so that border has helped, but like I said, I recommend you give it a bit of a blocking or store it as flat as possible. And once the whole blanket has been put together, all of that rolling will disappear. Fasten off, grab your yarn needle, and you can weave that tail in under some of the stitches along that back row. So I like to work on the back. Just take my needle and weave it underneath some of those stitches. And while I'm back here, let's take a look at the back of this stitch pattern. It looks just like knitting. If you look at the underside of your plain stockinette stitch, it looks an awful lot like that. I just love how different the front and the back of the Tunisian simple stitch looks. You can weave your tail in underneath that last row of stitches, back and forth once or twice. It's pretty tight stitching, so you shouldn't find that your tails want to come undone. I like to pull it tight. And then I'll just double back, and this is going to be the same little technique we use all year long for weaving in. So just double back underneath some of those same stitches. There we go. I like to hold on to that little nub, pull out my needle, and there's my tail all nicely woven in. A little roly-poly, but an absolutely lovely sample of the Tunisian simple stitch. Here is my completed square, all nice and blocked up. If you've never done steam blocking or wet blocking, then we've got some links to videos we've done on that in the description box down below, and we'll also pin them in the pinned comment. I recommend, if you are blocking it, to flip it upside down, because the roll wants to go in the opposite direction of the wrong side. So you can sort of unroll it so that the roll is pushing against gravity, and then you can block it from the opposite side. Let it dry completely before you store it or before you turn your crochet projects into anything, certainly before you wrap them up. And you can store your various squares nice and flat. And that will help them keep their shape, and it also makes them easier to turn into a blanket down the road. So that is the January square, the Tunisian simple stitch, and once again we'll put those links for all the blocking tutorial information we've got in the description box down below. We'll also put it in the pinned comment for you. So if you do want to start blocking your squares as you go throughout the year, then we've got those resources there, and it'll help keep things flat for storage purposes. Just remember to let it dry completely before you put them away. We hope you enjoyed the January installment of our 2022 Totally Tunisian Crochet Calendar Blanket, and we will see you back here soon on the Jayda InStitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have a great week. Bye, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.